Let's come back to the skin color and talk about somebody based on their skin color, how light hygiene may change. And you mentioned somebody with darker skin would be better off at, a more tropical area getting more sunlight. But what if they are, due to family, due to a job, forced to live up north? What can they do to hack that?
Melanin is a sponge for light. Melanin is actually really interesting, and it's going to be one of the major pillars in my lab that we're going to be focusing on. Because not only is it this pigment that absorbs all wavelengths of light from radio frequencies, aka non-native EMFs, all the way up through gamma radiation, it is a major protective mechanism against radiation in general. If we're thinking about, protecting our organs and tissues from the effects of non-native EMFs or radon or whatever other kind of gamma radiation we might be exposed to, building your melanin, building your solar callus is a great way to buffer your body against these exposures. But in addition to that, melanin is also a potent heavy metal chelator, so it can pull heavy metals out of the bloodstream and protect your tissues against damage from these heavy metals as well. Like I mentioned, melanin is likely also to play a role in the bioenergetics of the system. So if somebody is born and naturally has more melanin in their skin, it really should be seen as a blessing and as a superpower. Meanwhile, there's like this just crazy colonial mindset that is embedded within science and medicine and culture, frankly, throughout the Western world, but also within Latin America as well. I have so many friends and clients who have family in Latin America who don't want to get a tan because it's seen as being a lower class in their society. And it's just like this archaic colonial mindset where like the colonialism basically says that like, light skin is, superior in some way and that darker skin is bad or dirty or something. And it's like, actually, that is propaganda that is geared towards disempowering the population. Meanwhile, melanin is this, incredible molecule that supports health in so many different ways. So if you naturally are gifted with more melanin, the consideration that I like to bring up first and foremost is like, if we look at vitamin D as a biomarker, so I mean, kind of just as a brief tangent, vitamin D is something a lot of people supplement with, and they think that they're doing something good. But all of the big trials, like the VITAL study, which was a massive study on vitamin D supplementation and health outcomes, showed no benefit to supplementing with vitamin D on any chronic disease states, cancers, diabetes. I think were a couple of the major outcomes they were looking at, despite the fact that vitamin D deficiency is highly associated with the incidence and severity of multiple different disease states. So the main takeaway from that, for me, is that vitamin D is a biomarker of your time spent outdoors and not necessarily this marker that you should supplement for to optimize. There will be some exceptions, like if people have overt rickets, like let's say sub 12 nanograms per milliliter, they'll probably get a benefit from supplementing in the short term to help bolster their levels and at least protect their bones and teeth from decalcification and, the issues that can happen therein. However, for people who are like 20 nanograms per mil roughly or above, that is not a range that we're looking to supplement. That's a range we're looking to optimize our sun exposure habits to get that into the optimal range, which is between 60 and 80 nanograms per milliliter. That is a range that would suggest that you're getting enough sunlight exposure for your body. And that already accounts for melanation. Because melanin is a sponge for light, the more melanin you have, the more that light gets sequestered away and the less light there is available to make that conversion of 7-dehydrocholesterol into pre-vitamin D. And so what that means is your vitamin D status as somebody with more melanin is a sign if you're getting enough UVB light for you. And so if you are highly deficient and you're still getting a lot of sun, if you're at a more northern latitude, I mean, the sun quality is just quite poor for basically half the year relative to where your ancestors would have come from in a more equatorial region. So in those cases, if people can't be like a snowbird and go to another, more equatorial place for a part of the year, you can leverage something like the vitamin D lamp from Spurdy, for example, to help give your body some of that stimulus that it's looking for while still staying at your more northern latitude. The other thing that I will mention there as well is that nature doesn't make mistakes, and in the wintertime when UV light is low and days are short, we're meant to get cold because the cold is what allows the mitochondria to be stimulated to make more of their own infrared and UV photons. And so it's kind of this perfect balance when UV and infrared light are low in the environment because it's wintertime. The cold helps the body compensate for that lack of outside in UV and infrared light and make its own. And so there is, let's say a hypothesis out there that I actually want to test in the lab as well, that perhaps cold could either change the expression of vitamin D binding protein to help vitamin D stay more stable in the circulation in the wintertime. Or perhaps even some of the UV photons made in the mitochondria could actually escape into the greater cellular environment and actually convert some of that 7-dehydrocholesterol into vitamin D. We don't know that, but it's certainly feasible given that the light that our mitochondria is making is actually stronger than that produced by the sun. It's actually in the UVC range, these biophotons, not even in the UVB range. UVC light doesn't make it through the atmosphere. It gets, absorbed or scattered. So this is like very high energy photons that are being produced within the cell, within the mitochondria. And furthermore, because the scale is so small and the proximity is so close, the intensity of these photons is very high. So there's something called the inverse square law, which is also relevant to the non-native EMF story, which states that the closer you are to a source of EMFs, the higher the intensity. So what that means for non-native EMFs is that if you're right next to a Wi-Fi router, it's worse than if you were across the house from a Wi-Fi router. Or if you have your cell phone in your pocket, it's worse than if it was on the table in front of you or your laptop on your lap, etc. You want to always try to put some distance between you and the source of non-native EMFs. On the flip side, when it comes to biophotons, because we're talking about the atto and the femto level, like very, very, very small scales within cells, these photons are going to have very strong effects because the source of the creation of these photons is right next to, in proximity to, things that it might be acting on. So I think there's a ton that we can learn there with regards to the potential effects on vitamin D, pharmacodynamics in the bloodstream, and also other actions that those biophotons could be having within the system. But suffice to say for now that I think if you're somebody with darker skin or more equatorial mitochondria, like a more coupled mitochondrial haplotype, which comes from equatorial regions, you'll still likely benefit from getting cold in the wintertime or just cold in general to help your body assimilate to that environment a bit more readily. And people with uncoupled mitochondria, so my dad's side of the family is black, my mom's side is white, so my mitochondria came from my mom, and my mom's mitochondria came from Scandinavia, so I have Viking mitochondria, but I have medium, I would say Fitzpatrick foreskin right now. And so my mitochondria are actually expecting to receive cold for a period of the year. And so I, lean into that quite a bit because I'm in New Jersey, so we do have seasons. And so I do a lot of cold plunging during the summer as well. Mostly cold walks during the winter time. But cold is a great way to help compensate for poor light in the environment, is basically the punchline of what I was trying to say.
Got it. So it can be looked at almost like a backup for us up in the north in the wintertime when we're getting less light.
Yep. And in general as well, if you're somebody who, let's say certain days of the week, that you're gonna not be able to get outside for midday sun, for example, or at all even, for more than a few minutes, you could leverage cold in some way to help buffer your body against that.
So when it comes to melanin, a few minutes back you went deeper into it, but it sounds like at least two of the roles then, as we build our solar callus, the melanin is going to help us protect from the sun in the future. And then also you mentioned it can be used for energy creation. Can you talk more about the latter?
Yeah, so this is the hypothesis that Dr. Herrera has proposed that directly relates to what we observed in the mushrooms, basically in Chernobyl, whereby the mechanism is this. So it is believed that melanin can be activated by light in the environment, whether it's gamma radiation or let's say UV light or the light from the sun. And when it gets stimulated, that it has the ability to split water molecules into free electrons. So this is actually how photosynthesis works in plants. There's a water splitting complex that involves chlorophyll, which is what gives the green parts of plants the green pigment. So the chlorophyll absorbs the photonic energy of sunlight, and it gets powered up enough to be able to activate this water splitting complex that allows electrons to be stripped out of water. And those free electrons can then basically power metabolism. And in plants, it's used to power the production of starch, essentially, glucose production. But in humans, the idea is that our melanin, basically it's even more efficient than chlorophyll at doing this. So chlorophyll can generate 2 electrons per water molecule. Melanin, in theory, can produce actually 4 free electrons per water molecule. So the idea is that these free electrons can be generated from this stimulation of melanin by some form of high energy light, and that would then allow those electrons to directly power metabolism. And there's melanin throughout the body as well. So not only in our skin, but also in the inner ear, the nasal mucosa, the oral mucosa, deep in the brain. And actually, the primary defect in Parkinson's disease is loss of melanin over time within the substantia nigra. So melanin can actually be broken down to make dopamine. Both dopamine and melanin have the same precursor, which is called tyrosine. It's an amino acid. And so in a person with Parkinson's disease where these dopamine producing cells in the substantia nigra become toxic basically, and there's a lot of reasons why that might be. I believe that it's generally rooted in mitochondrial dysfunction within the brain, specifically within that part of the brain, because when those mitochondria become defunct, there's both the issue of what's causing them to have that issue to begin with, which is usually some form of oxidative stress or direct environmental influence that is impairing mitochondrial function. Then new melanin is struggled to be made because the mitochondria need to be active to make melanin. And then the body can compensate for a period of time by breaking down melanin to make dopamine versus making dopamine de novo from tyrosine. But over time, eventually that ability wanes. And if you look at late stage Parkinson's, it's highly associated with loss of melanin in the substantia nigra. And this is also coupled with the very interesting fact that virtually no patients of African origin, so people with dark skin, do not get Parkinson's disease. And there's this very interesting embryological origin of melanocytes. So melanocytes come from the same embryo origin as the brain tissue, the skin tissue, and the immune cells as well. And so they all come from neuroectoderm. And so there is this hypothesis that Jack has largely purported that melanin, like melanocytes, can actually travel in the body as needed. So if melanin is needed somewhere, I didn't mention this earlier, but melanin is also a potent antioxidant. It can quench reactive species in the environment. So if the body senses that there is inflammation or rampant reactive oxygen species in some part of the organism, it can send more melanocytes to the area to help quench some of that. And so the idea is that in patients and people with dark skin, that there's a higher capacity to allow melanin and melanocytes to mobilize where they would need to go to prevent diseases like Parkinson's that have directly to do with this melanin issue. So it's actually like a really interesting area of study that's kind of low-hanging fruit and not being looked at enough, in my opinion. But I think it opens the door, right, to a lot of counter-narrative questions, because the mainstream narrative tells you that there's no such thing as a healthy tan, despite the fact that we've, outlined all of these benefits of melanin for not only, the skin, but for the organism as a whole. So when you start to ask these questions about like Parkinson's and melanin and how people with dark skin don't get it, it opens the door for a lot of really other inconvenient rather questions.
Would it be fair to say somebody like me with generally really light skin, my heritage being from far north, that I'm in Ontario and say 8 months of the year I'm very pale, I barely get any sun, that I'm basically wasting a lot of the benefits I could be getting if I was down south and maintaining a tan and that melanin year round?
Yeah, so I would say it depends on how you're leveraging your environment. Like if you're really embracing cold and your mitochondria come from a more northern region, you could probably get away with it. The problem is that a lot of people, are living between 68 and 73 degrees year round. Cold is something that a lot of people just absolutely hate. And it kind of makes sense because I think we have like this ancestral trauma of like dying from freezing to death versus it's much harder to die from overheating. It can happen, but it's way less traumatic, I think. So it requires you easing into it. You don't want to go 0 to 100. But if you can embrace cold, your mitochondria are kind of primed to do that, if they're uncoupled from these more northern regions. But there's the added issue of like if somebody already has some sort of chronic disease state, it can be really hard to undo that in the environment that they're currently in, that they develop that disease in. So oftentimes getting somebody to go down into more tropical areas for a period of time, even if it's just for a month or two, can really expedite that healing process because there's just so much more free energy you're able to harness from the environment down there because of the higher photonic energy of the sunlight that's available, as well as the light stability. It's just like 12 hours of light and 12 hours of dark every day. So it's very easy to get into a rhythm with your sleep patterns and like getting into circadian alignment. And it's just more enjoyable, right? To be outside, it's beautiful. So, like, there's just a lot of perks to being in an environment like that to expedite the healing process. And if you leverage high intensity sunlight with cold, that can expedite things even more because when you do that, you're not only getting tons of UV light from the outside in, you're also making a ton inside as well. So you're kind of hitting it from both directions, which can help to optimize essentially the biophysics of the system. And this goes back to Becker's work, actually, who confirmed that the body is made basically chock full of semiconductors that work the same way as the semiconductors that, the tech pros in Silicon Valley are studying for, developing new tech and what's in our cell phones and everything like that. Semiconductors allow the flow of, or permit the flow of electrons under certain conditions, but semiconductors work better under cooler conditions. So for us, what that means is as humans, if we get cold for longer periods of time, like what I typically do and recommend is a 55-degree cold plunge. And then I stay in there for like 25 to 45 minutes. And I do that 2 to 3 times a week, I would say. And staying in for that longer period of time allows your body temperature, your core temperature to go down. If you're only in for like 2 to 5 minutes, your skin temperature decreases, but your core temperature stays the same or actually increases because all that blood is being shunted inwards. So we actually want to stay in long enough to let the core temperature drop down, which allows all of the semiconductors throughout the body to work more efficiently. So melanin is a semiconductor. Collagen is a semiconductor, so you can think about all of the fascia networks throughout the body are made of semiconductors. Bone is a semiconductor, and actually, interestingly, Becker found that bone is literally a light-emitting diode, so it's an LED composed of the P-type semiconductor, collagen, and the N-type semiconductor, apatite, and together they form a light-emitting diode that emits red-brown light. The issue is that you can't actually see the bone glowing because the light is retained within the system. It's not lost to the environment. So, and actually this goes back to Roland Van Wyck's work, who has shown that if you look at the photons lost from somebody's body, it's actually predictive of whether or not they're sick or they're old. So the sicker you are and the older you are, the more photons you lose to your environment. And the younger and healthier you are, the more photons you retain. So you're actually bleeding less light. And you can kind of think about that as like you're retaining energy, right? You're not wasting energy into your environment. Instead, you're able to use it productively internally. And so that is reflected at the level of like using a photomultiplier on somebody's body and seeing less light emitted from the system.
You talked about this synergy for somebody who is sick, getting the light from being down south, plus mixing the cold in. Is there a way that they could push that too far?
I don't know. I mean, certainly there is. I mean, people can get way too much sun and people can get too much cold, and there's definitely considerations for women as it relates to cold. So, from my personal experience, and from the experience of some clients as well, for women who are actively cycling, doing too cold for too long can be too much for the body. It can just be too much of a stressor. The woman's body needs less of a stressor to get the response. So, I recommend women just like track their cycles and like track their hormones every morning with like an Anito or Mira fertility monitor that allows you to measure estrogen, progesterone, luteinizing hormone, and follicle stimulating hormone so that you can see, like, get a baseline for a month, and then you can see if you're, starting to do some cold plunging, if things are shifting around a lot or if, things are changing in a negative way. But the sweet spot for me is like every other day at most, cold plunging for 25 to 45 minutes. And when I do that, my cycle is, perfect. There's no issues at all. And it also actually dramatically reduces PMS and menstrual cramps as well. So I actually highly recommend it for women. Um, So there's that piece. Like people can overdo cold, especially women. Men can tolerate much colder temperatures and longer times, typically speaking, but you still want to work up to doing that, right? So, like when I first started plunging, even at 55 degrees, I was just doing like 2 minutes at a time and I would do it like a couple times a day. And now I just, I'm so used to it now. And by used to it, I mean I built up my brown fat to such an extent that like I can tolerate cold better now, because the more you avoid cold, the more you deplete your brown fat, which is this metabolic and endocrine organ that exists within the body. That is, its job is to produce heat in response to cold. So there was actually some research suggesting that only about 10% of adults are walking around with any detectable brown fat, because everybody's sitting at this 68 to 73 degree temperature year round and never challenging themselves with cold exposure. But the benefit of this is that that tissue is quite plastic. So even if you have a small amount, you can grow it back. And you can also make what's called bright fat or beige fat, which is a brown fat like tissue that can develop within your white subcutaneous fat. So there's a lot of way to help build back your tolerance, even if you had been cold averse for many years. So you want to just start slow. Like you can maybe start with just dunking your face in some ice water. Then you could work up to doing like cold packs on your core, and then maybe work up to cold plunging at like 70 degrees for a few minutes, and then work your way down to like 55 is the sweet spot, in my opinion, of being cold enough to work in a positive way on your biophysics, but also not so cold that you can't stay in for a long time safely. So it's kind of a sweet spot for that. And if you're doing that gradually, in the same way that you want to build your solar callus gradually, you also want to build your cold tolerance up gradually. And if you do that, you'll be able to tolerate quite a bit. And you'll know because, once you start to become adapted, when you get in to that 55 degree water and you're in there for a couple minutes, you could then be in there for an hour and it feels like nothing. It just feels easy. That's literally your brown fat turning on and making that heat internally that's allowing you to adapt to the stimulus. So yeah, I would say there's definitely ways that people could overdo it, but as long as you're taking like a slower and steady approach to your sun exposure and your cold exposure, you're going to be setting yourself up for a win.
How do you feel about cold showers? Somebody that doesn't have a cold plunge.
Yeah,
You're
I
making a
hate them.
face. Yeah, talk more about that.
I mean, they're just miserable. I just hate them. They just feel awful, right? Because like you're not able to fully immerse your body. So it's like part of you is freezing and the other part of you is not. And then you have to turn and then like it's just miserable. It just feels bad. But like it's still a benefit for your neurochemistry. Cold is a major stimulator of dopamine and norepinephrine. So it's really good for focus, cognition, energy levels. It's also going to be beneficial for helping to stimulate some of that brown fat to help give you some of that stimulus. But I would say the best kind of alternative solution would be if somebody has a bathtub to just fill that up instead and like submerge as much of themselves as they can into the bathtub water, because then you're going to get more of that global adaptive response throughout the body versus this very like piecemeal response that you get from a cold shower. But yeah, cold shower is definitely better than nothing at all. I would say cold baths is going to be the second best. And you can even get like chillers online for a couple $100 that will allow you to get your bath water a bit colder. For me here in Jersey in the wintertime, our water does get down to around 55 degrees, which is around optimal. But in the summertime around here, it's closer to 65, which if you're a beginner, you still may want to start around 65 or even a little bit warmer. So like that's probably a great place to start. Otherwise, we now have the Morosco, so like we've had that for almost a year now, and so the forage is actually in the sun all day long. So when I plunge, it's also I'm like getting sun at the same time, and it is like a special type of magic when you're getting like the nice warm sun on your face and like your shoulders, but then the rest of you is just getting like chilled down. And the other benefit of the Morosco is it's also fully grounded. So when you get into that tub, it's kind of like going into the ocean in that you're getting like basically this soup of electrons that your body is able to access. And I also have like about 10 pounds of Epsom salts in the forage as well. So there's also the benefit of the magnesium and helping to relax the body. So yeah, it's wonderful if people feel so inclined and they like really want to take their, plunging to the next level. The forage is like the best on the market in my opinion.
I want to come back to DHA, and you did go deep into it before, and I think you may have touched on this piece, but I want to talk about the creation of energy from light by upping our DHA in the diet. And you talk about this in your ebook where you want people eating a certain amount of DHA to get this benefit.
Yeah, so there's actually maybe a little bit of an interesting distinction here. So I think melanin and DHA share some things in common. The melanin part of the story is really about harnessing photonic energy to make energy within the system. I mean, in theory at least, we still have to flesh that out, but it seems very plausible. The DHA part of the story is really allowing your body also to harness photonic energy from the sun, but for a different purpose. So the DHA is going to help prevent burning also by maintaining a lower inflammatory state in the body, but it's also allowing you to, I mean, it's DHA is a really interesting thing because there are some like recycling mechanisms within the eyes and the brain that allow its levels and its like the molecules that are there to be retained and recycled in some way. But you might imagine that having a poor DHA status could actually result in people being less present because you're literally not interfacing with as much of the energy from your environment, the photonic information from your environment that is actually giving you access to your sensory apparatus, basically. And so I don't think there's any research on this, but it would be an interesting question to propose that, like, if we had a way that we could assess DHA status in the central nervous system, maybe a good proxy would be blood levels, for example. If there's a way to determine if somebody's awareness is actually influenced by that status, because, like I mentioned earlier, that DHA is basically taking photons and converting them into electrical impulses that then allow the brain to process that information and make sense of it. So it's working at like a very fundamental level that I think we still have some interesting questions that could be proposed there, but I definitely recommend people check out Dr. Crawford's work if they're interested in learning more on DHA, and he has some really great review papers on the quantum biologic mechanisms of how DHA is working. And yeah, it's very, very foundational and a super interesting topic to delve into.
If you enjoyed that clip, you're going to want to head over here and catch the full episode. I'll see you over there.
UV light produces this complex prohormone in the body called proopiomelanocortin, or POMC. POMC is cleaved into 10 different hormonal products, one of which is beta endorphin, which is a natural opioid that the body makes in response to UV.